starting on page 21, Barclay gives us an overview, and he calls this chapter Crisis. And says here in chapter 12, we read the history of a series of crucial events in the life of Jesus. And in the lives of every one of us, there are decisive moments, times, and events on which the whole of our lives hinge. And in one of my other commentators, they said that Matthew takes all of his Sabbath stories and puts them all in this one place. So that's a thing.
Yeah, sort of like he took all of the preparation for the disciples and put it together, and then
so this
together theme.
This is all the Sabbath stories. And so here we see the first definite steps, the end of which has to be the cross. Says we can see 4 stages in their increasing attitude of hostility toward Jesus. In verses 1 through 8, we see growing suspicion. In verses 9 through 14, we see hostile investigation. In verses 22 through 32, we see deliberate and prejudiced blindness. And in verse 14, we see evil determination. So in the face of all of this, the answer of Jesus is clearly delineated. And we see 5 ways that he meets this growing opposition. He meets it with courageous defiance. He meets it with warning. He gives the most terrible warnings. He says if they persist in shutting their eyes, they will have shut themselves out from the grace of God. He meets them with a series of claims that he is greater than the temple and he's greater than Jonah. And I didn't know this, but according to Barclay, Jonah, no preacher ever produced repentance so amazingly as Jonah did. He claims he's greater than Solomon. And number 4, he met with the statement that his teaching is essential. And 5th, he meets it with an invitation. And the invitation is to enter into kinship with him. So that's a brief overview of chapter 12.
And that's a similar pattern with 10 and 11 too.
Yeah.
You know, because they're pretty stern, and then he, you know, the welcoming love of God with both of those chapters and this one too then.
Yeah. So Matthew is a very deliberate, you know, the writing is very deliberate, very I can't think of the word.
Organized, or there's a structure?
Organized, but the same, like you said, it's the same pattern. He has a formula. So if somebody would care to read verses 1 through 8, I would appreciate it.
I'll do that.
Okay.
At that time, Jesus went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing that which is not permitted to do on the Sabbath day." He said to them, "Have you not read what David and his friends did when he was hungry, how he went into the house of God and ate the shewbread, which it was not permissible for him nor for his friends to eat, but which the priests alone may eat? Or have you not read in the law that the priests profane the Sabbath and yet remain blameless? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known the meaning of the saying, 'It is mercy that I wish and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned those who are blameless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." And it mentions that the last phrase should perhaps be translated, "For man is the master of the Sabbath."
Okay. I want to read, and some of y'all are familiar with this book. A description of the Sabbath. To understand this text, one must first gain some sense of the meaning of the Sabbath in first century Jewish life. To observant Jews, the Sabbath was a joy, not a burden. Since the Sabbath was so central in Jewish life, it was important to be observed properly. One of the 10 Commandments prohibits working on the Sabbath. In view of the ambiguity of the scripture itself as to what constituted work, a body of tradition having the force of religious law had been developed to guide the proper celebration of the Sabbath. Humane considerations were paramount. Jewish tradition, as preserved in the Talmud, had already decided that commandments that affect relations between human beings take precedence over commandments between God and human beings. God himself wills that human good take precedence over laws that concern God's honor. Thus, setting aside strict observance of the Sabbath for human good was a way of honoring God. This point was already made in Judaism. Its exact application was disputed, however. Some rabbis taught that an animal that fell into a pit on the Sabbath could be helped out. Others, including the Essenes of the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically rejected this. Some Jews considered healing on the Sabbath to be permitted, others only if life is in danger. So that gives you a little background on the Sabbath and how it was viewed. Morning, Claire.
Good morning.
Okay. So it reminded me of, we're still like that. As humans, we just like to argue, sometimes for the sake of argument, teeny tiny little bitty points of discussion or law. Reminds me of my dad and my mother's father. I don't know that they ever, and we visited at least once a month when I was growing up. We never had a visit where there wasn't an argument because the two of them enjoyed it so much. Just pick a topic. And in reality, I think they agreed with each other most of the time, but my dad would take the opposite side just to have fun arguing. So those of you that know me real well, which is pretty much everybody here, that's where I get it. Okay, any comments so far? Quiet group today.
Maybe they did well in, what do you call it, when there are clubs that get together in high school and argue.
Yeah, debate clubs.
Right.
Yeah, I was captain of my debate team.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
Now, Sarah, ironically, I don't see you as being an arguer. Now, I don't know what Tom would say, but
Very loving.
What'd you do? Smart man. Okay. In the eyes of the scribes and the Pharisees, the fault of the disciples was not that they had plucked and eaten the grains of corn, but that they had done so on the Sabbath. Sabbath law was very complicated and very detailed, as I just showed you. Commandment forbids work on the Sabbath, but the interpreters were not satisfied. So they even broke it down into reaping, winnowing, threshing, and preparing a meal. And if you wanted to get that picky, the disciples had performed each one of those different work tasks.
oh.
And what they did was not considered stealing, that fields had paths through them, and it was acceptable, to walk down the path and to, if you were a traveler, because remember, they didn't have a Burger King down at the end of the path. It was acceptable for you to, pick an ear of corn and eat it. Now, it was not acceptable for you to take a sickle and start chopping down, but whatever you could take, in your hand was acceptable. Later on, they had a Jewish teacher said to pluck ears is a kind of reaping. And by plucking the ears, they were guilty of reaping. By rubbing it in their hands, they were guilty of threshing. By separating the grain and the chaff, they were guilty of winnowing, and by the whole process, they were guilty of preparing a meal. For everything that was to be eaten on the Sabbath was supposed to be prepared the day before. And remember when the Moses and the Hebrew people were out in the wilderness for 40 years, that the day before the Sabbath, there was twice as much manna to be gathered, so that they didn't have to gather manna on the Sabbath because that would have constituted work. So that tradition goes back thousands of years. Okay. So to meet the criticism of the scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus put forward 3 arguments. Number 1, he quotes the action of David, and this comes from 1 Samuel, and says that there was one point, and I don't remember this story, I don't know if any of y'all do, where David and his young men were so hungry, they went into the tabernacle, not the temple, because the temple hadn't been built yet, but into the tabernacle, and took bread that was only supposed to be eaten by the priest. And it consisted of 12 loaves of bread, which were placed each week in 2 rows of 6. And then they were changed every week, and the old loaves were given to the priest. And God didn't strike them down, so that was considered okay. He also quoted the Sabbath work of the temple, and I hadn't thought about this. There was a lot of work for the priest to do on the Sabbath because the number of sacrifices increased on that day. So the priest, think about Cindy. Cindy worked hard all week, but Sunday is her busiest day. Mm-hmm. Same thing for the priest in the temple. So, if the priest can work, so can we. And then he quoted God's word to Hosea the prophet, I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice. What God desires far more than ritual sacrifice is kindness, the spirit which knows no law other than it must answer the call of human need. And I thought that was a very powerful statement.
Mm-hmm. 3 pretty strong arguments from the history of Judaism.
Yeah.
Yep.
So taking care, loving each other, taking care of each other is the message. Just like Jesus said, the greatest commandment is love God, and the second one is to love everybody else. And if we could all just figure that out, it'd be amazing.
Would be here.
Right.
Yeah. In this incident, Jesus makes it clear the claim of human need must take precedence over all other claims. Claims of worship, ritual, and liturgy are important, but prior to any of them is the claim of human need. And then Barclay goes on and tells stories, a couple of stories of more recent situations. One where a young man joined some kind of holy order, and when he got there, the guy in charge said, well, we're taking care of homeless boys. And he said, well, go, clean up the bathroom while we put him to bed. And the guy went and looked at the bathroom and went, I didn't join this order to clean up after dirty boys. He lasted about 7 minutes, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then a story about a woman kind of in the same situation, that sometimes the women were looking forward to quiet prayer and they had to wash the dishes. Jesus insisted that the greatest ritual service is the service of human need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, now this next statement here was a surprise to me. It's an odd thing, and I'm on page 29, if you're interested. It's an odd thing to think that, with the possible exception of that day in the synagogue at Nazareth, we have no evidence that Jesus ever conducted a church service in all of his life on earth. But we have abundant evidence that he fed the hungry, comforted the sad, cared for the sick. Yeah, that was my reaction.
Well, he taught. Well, he wasn't a priest, was he?
Mm-mm. But still, it apparently was
He
there.
taught in the synagogue on several occasions.
Yeah, I'm kind of confused by the way this was
Debate
worded.
that.
Yeah, I think, how do you define church service?
Well, maybe to say a worship service.
Yeah,
Yeah, that might have been. But
Or a
anyways,
Christian worship service.
right.
Right. Yeah, because there wasn't one at that point.
well, he does put the word church in quotations.
Right.
So
Yeah, that his ministry wasn't
when you
about
look
Sunday
at-
morning.
Yeah, I don't understand that at all with the teachings and the gatherings
synagogues.
and so forth. And
yeah, that I put an asterisk by it to make sure I got your comments there.
Is that like two Pinocchios? In the rating scheme that the news organizations use? We have Barkley two.
Just hush.
Yes, dear.
Christian service is not a monastic retreat. It is involvement in all the tragedies and problems and demands of the human situation.
I mean, I think about, Jesus would get in the boat and then put back a distance and, teach multitudes. So if we have our church service outside, does that mean it no longer is a church service?
Excellent point. I think it's still a church service.
Yeah, but in the tent is a revival.
Yeah, Barkley was wrong here.
well, let's get real
Yeah,
philosophical. The people had to go back. You said they joined something and they were asked to do dishes. And I was thinking, on a good day, doing dishes is a form of prayer.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Doing any of that. That's
Right.
right. The
So,
monks and monasteries, and Barclay has an issue with monastic groups. So yeah, but most of them have some means of support, and it's typically they're not like working as CPAs or something like that. The monks up in Berryville make fruitcakes, and they do out at Gethsemane too in Kentucky. Some of them farm. So, but it's that, that prayer, and that work is prayer for them. I mean, that's very much central to their day-to-day lives. That work is prayer.
Y'all need to talk more. I'm getting too far through what I prepared here.
You could talk slower.
Tom says I could talk slower.
you can give a test.
One of my former colleagues sent me a text this week and said that she had retired, that it had just gotten so bad that she had finally gotten fed up and she retired. So yeah, my testing days are past me. Okay. Now these are Barclay's words here. There remains in this passage one difficulty which is not possible to solve with absolute certainty. And the difficulty lies in this last phrase, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And we've talked about this before. And so he gives two suggestions. It may mean that Jesus is claiming to be Lord of the Sabbath, in the sense that he is entitled to use the Sabbath as he thinks fit. We have seen that the sanctity of the work of the temple surpassed and overrode the Sabbath rules and regulations. And then number two, on this occasion, Jesus is not defending himself or for anything he did on the Sabbath. He's defending his disciples. And the authority which he is stressing here is not so much his own authority as the authority of human need. And when Mark tells this story, Mark has the saying that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
Yeah.
If you remember that one.
And in my Bible, it has a note that part of the meaning of this is to say that that Jesus himself has the right to interpret the law of Moses authoritatively. That's another meaning to this. Which makes sense to me.
Well,
Yeah.
I also think that the Sabbath is supposed to be a time when we reflect and appreciate and give praise and thanks to God. But at the same time, life continues on the Sabbath here in the world, just as it does every other day. So, you know, when certain companies will say we close on Sunday because we don't want to make our workers work on the Sabbath, I kind of struggle with that, because can I only set aside time for God to worship him on Sunday, or am I supposed to be praying without ceasing?
And you don't have that kind of thing in a hospital. I mean, everyone doesn't not work at the hospital. And so I think that the Sabbath is for man. The rules, you know, are for us, not for, you know, we're not to be restricted if we're helping people.
And
Mhm.
I'm going to sound like a Pharisee. My dad worked for the FAA and kept the radar going so the planes could safely fly. So was that helping people?
Well, it certainly wasn't hurting them.
Well, that's true. But you know, you can, at what point, but what the bottom line is, I agree with Claire. But I can remember as a kid, and I expect all of you do too, you know, the blue laws, you know, grocery stores were not open. And then when they did start opening, they only sold food. You couldn't buy cleaning products because they didn't want to encourage you to clean on Sunday.
Well, I didn't know that.
Oh, I can remember being in a store where the cleaning section was taped off.
Huh.
Never.
As well as the spirits.
Yeah, as well as alcohol. They wouldn't sell alcohol on Sunday either.
And I think tobacco, any of the sin products.
The other day I was in Kroger before 9 a.m. and they wouldn't sell me a bottle of wine.
On Sunday? On a Sunday?
No.
Oh, so those laws are still in place in Tennessee, huh? I mean, I can remember when they started opening the stores on Sunday in Winston-Salem, you couldn't buy alcohol until it was like 1 or 2 o'clock. Be sure you know, everybody was out of church before you could buy.
No, it was like 5 minutes to 9 and we just stood there, the clerk and I, and at 9 o'clock, he's like, all right, here we go.
Oh, darn.
Or you just don't know the right neighbors in Tennessee. You ask for strawberries, that's the key word.
No, but I do think there is a segment of humanity that they do need those very explicit rules. You know, that Sunday is when you stop and think about God. And I can't help but think, since the elimination of blue laws, and there's others, you know, forces in play too, but church attendance and involvement in churches has dropped continuously since that time. So
Yeah, because when we were kids, there was nothing to do on Sunday morning except go to church. You either slept in or you went to church.
right, because everything on TV had to do with church too.
Yeah, all three
Davy and
channels.
Goliath was on, you know, the Protestant Hour was on radio.
Yeah, you might as well go in person.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
I remember, I remember hearing my parents tell this story that Sunday morning after church, leaving church, shaking the preacher's hand, they were behind somebody that asked the preacher, said, can you tell me, is it a sin to play cards on Sunday? And the minister said, well, is it a sin to play cards on Monday? And they said, no. He said, then it's not a sin today either. So I had a very enlightened minister when I was a kid.
Good for him.
He played
Yeah.
card Sundays.
Yeah, but I mean, that's how, I had one of my grandmother's sisters belonged to the Pentecostal church, and she thought it was a sin on any day to wear makeup,
Mhm.
And then she went to a revival with us, and it was not a Pentecostal revival, and the preacher was talking about how he didn't see anything wrong with a little bit of lipstick and rouge making the women prettier, and she just sat there and was horrified that a minister would say such blasphemous things. Okay, any other comments on that?
Nope.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to read this. This kind of rehashes some of what we said, but I did mark it here. The phrase "Son of Man" refers not to Jesus, but simply to man in the sense of all humanity. If we consider that Jesus there's a typo here. If we consider that what Jesus is pressing is the claims of human need, we remember that it is not himself, but his disciples he's defending. And I already read all that, didn't I? Jesus may well be rebuking the scribes and Pharisees for enslaving themselves and others with a host of tyrannical regulations, and he may well be here laying down a great principle of Christian freedom, which applies to the Sabbath as it does to all other things in life. Okay, so moving on to verses 9 through 14. Would somebody be willing to read that, Kathy?
Sure. He left there and went into their synagogue. And look, there was a man there with a withered hand. So they asked him, is it permitted to heal on the Sabbath? They asked this question in order that they might find an accusation against him. What man will there be of you? He said, who will have a sheep, and if the sheep falls into a pit on the Sabbath day, will not take a grip of it and lift it out. How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? So then it is permitted to do a good thing on the Sabbath day. To the man, he said, stretch forth your hand. He stretched it out, and it was restored, sound as the other. So the Pharisees went away and conferred against him to find a way to destroy him.
Okay.
Pharisees, I feel bad for them. I mean, they were just hell-bent and determined.
Yeah. And what Jesus did was not considered, it wasn't illegal. It wasn't a mortal sin. So they had to figure out something else for him. So this incident is a crucial moment in the life of Jesus. He deliberately and publicly broke the Sabbath law, and he knew the Pharisees were there. And the result was a conference of the Orthodox leaders to search out a way to eliminate him. We don't understand their attitude unless we understand the amazing seriousness with which they took the Sabbath law. The law forbade all work on the Sabbath, and Orthodox Jews would literally die rather than break it. And then he goes on to tell a story, and this just blew my mind, talking about the rising during the Maccabees' time, that there was one point where the Jews were taking refuge in the caves, and somebody sent a detachment of men to attack them. And because the attack was made on the Sabbath, they did nothing to defend themselves because that defense would have been considered work and allowed themselves to be slaughtered. And then Barclay tells another story. So let me read this one sentence here. This is the first one. So they attacked them on the Sabbath, and they died with their wives and children and livestock to the number of 1,000 persons. And this is out of First Maccabees. Even in a national crisis, even to save their lives, even to protect their nearest and dearest, Jews would not fight on the Sabbath.
At least those Jews didn't.
Yeah, those didn't.
Because you're talking earlier about there were differing opinions even in those days about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, apparently there are as many varieties of Judaism as there are Protestants today.
Mm.
You know, with the different levels of strictness or laxness and everything in between. And then he says that there was, because the Jews insisted on keeping the Sabbath law, that the Roman commander Pompey was able to take Jerusalem. You know, same thing, because it was the Sabbath, they didn't do something they could have to save themselves. And then he tells a third story, you know, the same thing. There was a Greek general who was allowed to capture Jerusalem because he attacked on the Sabbath. So 3 different stories of enemies attacking on the Sabbath, and he doesn't make it clear. And, you know, my inquiring mind wants to know, did these people know about this law and use it to their advantage, or was it just coincidence that they happened to attack on the Sabbath?
Well, the Greeks were pretty good soldiers, so I think that they probably knew about the law. And, you know, if I knew that someone wasn't going to fight me on a particular day, I think that's the day I'd go.
Yeah.
Try to capture them.
Yeah, because I expect once it happened one time, the word probably got out.
And also with just even the Orthodox neighborhoods today, I mean, you know when it's the Sabbath on a Saturday because you're driving through the city and everything is going, you know, full speed, and then you just get to this stretch where there's nothing and everything's closed and nobody's on the streets, and you're like, Orthodox section, and then you know.
Sorry.
Everyone's showing their kitties.
Now we have to show off our cats. Oh, now she's really paying attention to y'all.
But all
Yeah.
those Orthodox people could hire me to come and turn on their light switch. It's true.
Oh,
Yeah, this reminds me of Susan Baum talking about when they go to visit Phil's family. You know, he's Jewish, and they love having the Gentiles in the house because the Gentiles can do stuff and, you know, are willing to do things that they can't do. So apparently they're fairly Orthodox. It's like, oh, goody, you're here. You can do blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, Susan's reminding me, there's a fairly large Amish population near where I grew up, and you know they have all these strict rules and can't do, you know, use coal oil lamps and ride horses and all that, but they'll use your telephone all day long, and they'll come to work and use power tools all day long, and then go home and live that Amish lifestyle.
And they'll ride in your car, but they won't have a car. So
But I respect them.
I remember
we had where I grew up, we had Dunkards, and it was a big, I could just vaguely remember this, but it got to be a very big deal about the kids riding school buses. And I really don't remember, I was too young to know the details of it, but they finally had to work out something, I don't remember what, because these kids lived way out in the county and they had to ride school bus. It was too far to walk or to ride the horse. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't have even brought it up since I don't
Probably when
remember
they
that.
were 16, they dropped out of school, right? And there's some age thing where a lot of those, it's like you're forced to send
Uh-huh.
children to school, but after a certain time, then they don't have to go.
But I also can remember a lot of the well, not a lot, but a fair number of the kids would not join the church until they finished high school because they wanted to finish high school.
Yeah.
And I can remember one in particular. She was a beautiful girl. And she said that the church had problems with her because of her vanity, because she was quite frequently, elected to the Queen Court and blah, 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 blah. And she just flat refused to join church until she finished high school because she was enjoying doing all those things.
The understanding thing, I can't remember the exact word. I think it's called Rumspringer or something like that.
Yeah.
And at a certain age, they're allowed to go out and do anything they want to do, and then they have to decide, do they want to come back? And so some of them get pretty wild.
Yeah, I think the idea is that they make that decision with full information. They know what they're giving up
Mhm.
because they have the opportunity to go out and experience it. So they can say, I voluntarily make this choice. They don't get to say, well, you made me do this and I wouldn't have done this. So, and some of them never come
That
back.
makes a bit of sense. I sometimes question, we have, people joining the church when they're 9 or 10 years old and whatever. And I just don't know that they are ready to make that decision. I don't think they do make that decision in most cases.
Right, I agree. I joined when I was 9. I didn't know what I was doing, but that was the accepted way to do it.
Right, cognitively, you can decide more things, cognitive development such that you can make more choices for yourself, but to really understand all the ins and outs of it and the implications of it.
And the other end of that is your brain isn't fully developed. I don't know that mine ever did, but at 24 or something like that.
Right.
So Joe, that's why they got us to go in the service when we were a little younger.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
When they said up that hill, you would go.
That's right.
Yeah. That's also why insurance rates for men go down at the age of 25. Yeah, I don't know if y'all knew that. Yeah, insurance rates, especially for single men, are outrageous until they're 25 years old.
No, I remember that it's also for women, because at 25, I was thrilled that my car insurance went way down.
Okay. Okay, I've got a note to read something else to you from my other book. Okay. This is about verse 9. Except for the summary statement of 423 and 935, this is the first occasion for Jesus to be in a synagogue in Matthew. In Matthew, the synagogue is always an alien place of confrontation. The word there is added to Mark's synagogue, and Jesus is deliberately provoked by a test question rather than being merely watched. The Pharisees' question is hostile, not for information or discussion of a disputed legal point, but in order to accuse him. Sabbath violation does not, however, carry the death penalty and plays no role in the account of his trial. Matthew was again at pains to recast the scene from Mark into a dispute about proper observance of the Sabbath, not about the legitimacy of the Sabbath or the Torah. So that was another comment there.
Right, because where is it that Jesus, at the beginning of his ministry, I'm looking up Mark, goes into the temple or into the synagogue and teaches.
Yeah, and then his family says, and everybody says he's crazy.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Well, apparently for Matthew, that was the,
Mark.
and I'm not,
So it must be Luke.
yeah, maybe so. Okay, so anyway, Jesus reverses the argument on them. If it is right to do good on the Sabbath, then to refuse to do good is evil. And it was his basic principle that there is no time so sacred that it cannot be used for helping someone who is in need. We will not be judged by I really like this sentence. We will not be judged by the number of church services we have attended, or by the number of chapters of the Bible we have read, or even by the number of hours we have spent in prayer, but by the number of people we have helped when their need came crying to us. To this, at the moment, the scribes and Pharisees had nothing to answer, for their argument had rebounded on them. So Jesus healed the man, and in doing that, he gave the man three things. He gave him back his health.
Mhm.
Jesus is vitally interested in their well-being. Sickness and healing are acts of grace. And John Calvin described medicine as a gift from God. Those who bring healing are helping God. The cure of the human body is just as much a God-given task as the cure of their souls. Number two, because Jesus gave the man back his health, he also gave him back his work.
Mhm.
Without work to do, many people feel incomplete because in their work, they find self-satisfaction and a real sense of identity. Idleness can be harder to bear than pain. And if there's work to do, even sorrow loses at least some of its bitterness. I'm still trying to figure out how to be retired. So I related to that very closely. And then number three, because Jesus gave this man back his health and his work, he gave him back his self-respect.
If you need a little work, just come on over.
I think now that you're retired, you can really get down to your work.
Right.
You're not just having to earn money, or whatever, but now you can really do the important work.
Yeah, I'm having trouble figuring out what that's supposed to be right now.
This is one of them.
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
good point. And Barclay says we might well add a new beatitude. Blessed are those who give us back our self-respect.
Mm.
We discover our own worth again when on our own two feet and our own two hands, we can face life and with independence and provide for our own needs and for the needs of those dependent on us.
Mhm.
And that sounds very old-fashioned American to me. Americans are very independent-minded.
Mhm.
I remember my dad really emphasized to me that I should not ever, ever be dependent on anybody else. I was supposed to take care of myself, pay my own way, and never, ever ask anybody for help. And if I did, I was to immediately figure out a way to repay it.
Mm.
And sometimes that's been a problem. But that was how he was brought up.
Mhm.
In a sense, the highest compliment you can pay people is to persecute them. Interesting way of.
Oh.
Let me read that to you again. In a sense, the highest compliment you can pay people is to persecute them. It shows that they are regarded not only as dangerous, but effective. So the Pharisees saw Jesus as dangerous and effective. If he wasn't effective at spreading his word, they wouldn't have to bother with him.
True.
The action of the scribes and Pharisees is the measure of the power of Jesus Christ. True Christianity may be hated, but it can never be disregarded.
Mhm.
Very interesting way to look at things. Okay. And okay, next section, I'll read this
So
one.
here's an interesting question. If the Pharisees had not been part of this story, how much of Jesus's message would we have missed?
Excellent question.
Sort of in that vein, you know. The protagonist always plays a major role in a story.
There is a fable, I think, somewhere where two souls are in heaven and they agree to what they will be when they come to earth. And one of them agrees to be a protagonist or an evil person for the purpose of letting the second soul show love.
The evil is what helps show the love. Mhm.
Or maybe the impact of love. In other words, that would be lessened if there was no resistance.
Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, the only way you know light is by knowing dark.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I remember a sermon, Joe Bancroft's Pay Attention to Here. I remember a sermon that you preached years ago about driving out to the western part of the state. And it was a beautiful fall day and you weren't paying attention to it. And you had to go through a tunnel and it was dark. And when he came out, because he had been in the dark, then he saw the light and saw the beauty. And I remember that sermon, or at least that story of the sermon. So, yeah. Okay. I'll read this next passage. Because Jesus knew this, he withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all. And he strictly enjoined them not to surround him with publicity. All this happened that there might be fulfilled the word which came through Isaiah and which says, "Look you, my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved one in whom my soul finds delight. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will tell the nations what justice is. He will not strive, nor will he cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break the crushed reed, and he will not quench the smoking wick, till he sends forth his conquering judgment, and in his name shall the Gentiles hope." So there are two things here. Jesus shows that he has never confused recklessness with courage. So he's not just going out, he knows it's not time yet. So it's not time for a head-on clash. And so he says, don't advertise, don't talk about this. And he tries to avoid the confrontation.
Hmm.
And I want to read, no, never mind. I don't have time for that. So he will tell the nation what justice is, and Jesus certainly came to bring justice. He will not strive or cry aloud. And the word that was used there for cry aloud is like a barking dog or an unhappy audience that's booing at a show. And 3, he will not break the crushed reed, which is absolutely a worthless thing. He's not going to do away with it. And our wick may be fluttering, but Jesus is not going to put out our flame. He comes to encourage. He comes to treat the weak, not with contempt, but with understanding. And he's going to nurse that weak flame back to a stronger light. And the very last part of that, in him, Gentiles will hope. With Jesus, there came into the world the invitation, not to a nation, but to all people, to share in and accept the love of God. In him, God is reaching out to everyone with the offer of divine love.
Mhm.
Everybody, everywhere.
Yeah.